The year was 1870, and the American frontier stretched endlessly beneath a merciless sun. Dust devils danced across the barren plains of Wyoming Territory, where the small settlement of Copper Creek huddled against the vast emptiness like a collection of weathered bones. The town consisted of little more than a general store, a saloon, a small church with peeling white paint, and a scattering of homesteads that dotted the surrounding landscape like forgotten prayers. In this unforgiving land, where the wind carried more sand than hope, lived a young woman named Eleanor May Hartley. At 19, she possessed the kind of beauty that the harsh frontier life had not yet managed to steal away entirely, though it had certainly tried. Her auburn hair, once lustrous, now hung in simple braids, dulled by constant exposure to dust and sun. Her hands, which might have been soft in another life, bore the calluses of endless labor. But it was her eyes that told the truest story, gray as winter storms. They held both the fragility of crushed dreams and the stubborn strength of prairie grass that refuses to die. Eleanor's father, Thomas Hartley, had been a man of modest ambitions and grand hopes. He'd brought his family west 5 years prior, lured by tales of copper deposits in the nearby hills. The mine he'd staked had promised a fortune that would lift them from their hardscrabble existence back in Missouri. Instead, it had delivered only enough to keep them fed and sheltered. Barely. Thomas had been a gentle soul, more suited to reading books than breaking rocks. He'd taught Eleanor her letters and numbers, instilling in her a love of learning that seemed almost comical in a place where survival demanded every ounce of strength and left little room for the luxury of thought. He'd tell her stories in the evenings, his voice soft against the howling wind outside their small cabin. Stories of places where women wore silk dresses and attended grand balls, where music floated through the air like butterflies. But the mine, like all jealous mistresses, had demanded everything in the end. On a September morning that had started like any other, with the sun bleeding red across the horizon, Thomas Hartley had descended into the earth for the last time. The cave-in had been swift and total. They'd brought up his body 3 days later, along with those of 2 other men who'd been working the same shaft. Eleanor remembered the funeral with the clarity that only grief can bring. The preacher's words had been swallowed by the wind, and the few townspeople who'd attended had stood like scarecrows, uncomfortable in their Sunday clothes. She'd thrown a handful of dirt onto the pine box that held her father, and with it, she'd buried the last of her childhood. That had been 6 months ago. 6 months since Margaret Blackwood had arrived. Margaret was everything Thomas had not been, sharp where he was soft, calculating where he had been trusting. She'd appeared in Copper Creek 2 weeks after the funeral, claiming to be Thomas's widow from a marriage that had supposedly taken place during one of his supply runs to Cheyenne. She had papers, or at least documents that passed for legal in a territory where law was more suggestion than fact. The townspeople had accepted the story with the kind of weary indifference that characterized frontier life. What was one more hard-luck tale in a place built on broken dreams? Besides, a young woman needed looking after, didn't she? It was only proper that she have a mother's guidance. If only they knew. Margaret Blackwood was a woman carved from bitterness and disappointment. At 43, she had the harsh beauty of a winter landscape, striking but cold enough to kill. Her black hair, streaked with premature gray, was always pulled back in a severe bun that seemed to stretch her features into a permanent expression of displeasure. She'd come west after her first husband, or was it her second, had died under mysterious circumstances back in Kansas City. The frontier was good for losing histories, and Margaret had several she was eager to misplace. From the moment she'd installed herself in the Hartley cabin, life for Eleanor had transformed from difficult to unbearable. Margaret saw in her stepdaughter not a grieving girl who needed comfort, but an unpaid servant and, worse, a potential rival. In a territory where marriageable women were scarce, even a work-worn girl like Eleanor might attract attention that Margaret felt should rightfully be hers. The days blurred together in a haze of exhaustion and misery. Eleanor rose before dawn to tend the chickens and milk their ancient cow, Bessie. She hauled water from the well, each bucket feeling heavier than the last as the months wore on, and her body grew thinner from the meager portions Margaret allowed her. The garden, which had once been her father's pride, now fell entirely under her care. She coaxed vegetables from the unforgiving soil while Margaret sat in the shade of the porch, fanning herself and finding fault with everything Eleanor did. "You call that hoeing?" Margaret would snap, her voice like a whip crack in the still air. "My grandmother could work faster, and she's been dead 20 years. No wonder your father left nothing but debts. Laziness runs in your blood." The words stung worse than any physical blow, especially the lies about her father. Thomas Hartley had worked himself to death trying to provide for his daughter, but Eleanor had learned quickly that defending his memory only earned her Margaret's volcanic temper and a night without supper. The physical labor might have been bearable. Eleanor was young and had always been strong, but it was the isolation that gnawed at her soul like a cancer. Margaret had forbidden her from attending church, claiming she was needed at home. The few friends Eleanor had once had were told she was too busy to visit, too tired to attend the occasional social gathering at the schoolhouse. Gradually, they'd stopped asking. The only respite came in the small hours of the evening. After Margaret had retired to the bedroom that had once been her father's, Eleanor would slip out to the creek that ran behind their property, a thin ribbon of water that managed to survive even the driest months. She'd sit on a flat rock worn smooth by years of flooding, her bare feet dangling in the cool water, and allow herself to dream. Sometimes she imagined her father was still alive, that he'd walk out of the darkness with his gentle smile and tell her it had all been a terrible mistake. Other times, she pictured herself boarding one of the trains that passed through the larger towns, heading east to a city where no one knew her name or her sorrows. But most often, she simply stared at the stars scattered across the vast prairie sky and wondered if anyone, anywhere, ever thought of her. The creek became her sanctuary, the one place where Margaret's harsh voice couldn't reach. The cottonwoods that grew along its banks whispered secrets in a language she almost understood. The water sang songs of places far away, places where it had been and would go again, while she remained trapped like a fly in amber. On this particular evening, as spring struggled to assert itself against winter's stubborn grip, Eleanor sat in her usual spot, her thin shawl pulled tight against the chill. Her body ached from a day spent mending fences, work that should have been hired out to men, but Margaret claimed they couldn't afford. Her hands were raw and bleeding in places where the barbed wire had bitten through her worn gloves. She cupped water in her palms and watched it slip through her fingers, thinking how her life was doing the same. 19 years old, and she felt ancient. The girl who had once dreamed of attending a teacher's college in Denver, who had pressed flowers in books and written poetry in the margins of her father's newspapers, seemed like a stranger she'd once known. A coyote howled in the distance, its lonely cry echoing across the plains. Eleanor understood that sound in her bones, the call of a creature separated from its pack, searching for something it might never find. She pulled her knees to her chest and rested her chin on them, making herself small against the bigness of the world. Tomorrow would bring more of the same, more criticism, more impossible tasks, more hunger that gnawed at her belly like a living thing. Margaret had been in a particularly foul mood lately, ever since the traveling merchant had mistaken Eleanor for the lady of the house and Margaret for the hired help. The bruise on Eleanor's arm from that evening had faded to yellow, but the memory remained fresh as she sat there, watching the first stars appear in the darkening sky. Eleanor made a wish on each one, not for grand things. She'd learned the futility of grand wishes. She wished for small mercies, a day without cruel words, a full meal, a moment of kindness from anyone at all. But most of all, she wished for strength. Strength to endure another day, another week, another month of this existence that could barely be called living. The sound of Margaret's voice calling from the cabin shattered her reverie, sharp and demanding. It cut through the evening air like a blade. Eleanor sighed, rose from her rock, and began the walk back to her prison. Her bare feet knew every stone, every root on the path. She'd walked it so many times she could navigate it blind. As she approached the cabin, she could see Margaret's silhouette in the doorway, hands on hips, ready with whatever complaint had occurred to her in Eleanor's absence. The yellow light of the oil lamp spilled out behind her, making her look like some demon guarding the gates of hell. "Where have you been, you worthless girl?" Margaret's voice was already raised, though Eleanor was still 20 feet away. "The dishes aren't done. The floor needs sweeping. And you're out here gallivanting like you don't have a care in the world." Eleanor didn't respond. She'd learned that words were just more ammunition for Margaret to use against her. She simply lowered her head and walked past her stepmother into the cabin, ready to lose herself in the mindless rhythm of chores. But as she picked up the broom, a strange feeling overcame her, a tingling in her spine, a whisper of change in the air. She paused, looking out the window at the vast prairie stretching endlessly under the stars. Somewhere out there, beyond the horizon, life was happening. People were laughing, loving, living, and somehow, some way, she had to believe that one day she would be among them. For now. Though, she swept the floor, each stroke of the broom marking time in a life that had become nothing more than waiting. Waiting for what? She didn't know. But in a land where survival itself was an act of defiance, sometimes waiting was its own form of hope. The afternoon sun hung like a brass medallion in the cloudless sky, baking the earth until it cracked like old leather. It was the kind of heat that made the air shimmer and dance, creating mirages that promised water where only dust existed. Eleanor worked in the garden, her movements slow and careful as she conserved what little energy she had. The beans she'd planted were struggling, their leaves curled against the heat despite her faithful watering each morning and evening. She'd been up since before dawn, as always, completing a list of chores that seemed to grow longer with each passing day. Margaret had been in a particularly venomous mood all week, ever since she'd received a letter that had put a scowl on her face deeper than usual. Eleanor didn't know what the letter contained. Margaret guarded her correspondence like a hawk, but its arrival had coincided with an increase in both workload and cruelty. "Eleanor," Margaret's voice cracked like a whip from the porch. "Are you planning to take all day with those beans? The wash won't do itself." Eleanor straightened slowly, one hand pressed to the small of her back where a constant ache had taken up residence. She'd already done the wash yesterday, but Margaret had declared it not clean enough and demanded it be done again. The lye soap had left her hands raw and cracked, blood seeping from the deeper fissures. As she gathered her tools to move to the wash tub, she noticed a movement on the road that ran past their property. A lone rider was approaching, his silhouette dark against the bleached landscape. Visitors were rare enough to be noteworthy, and Eleanor paused to watch, shading her eyes with one battered hand. The rider sat tall in his saddle, moving with the easy grace of someone born to horseback. As he drew closer, she could make out more details. A weather-beaten hat pulled low against the sun, leather chaps dusty from travel, a rifle secured to his saddle, a drifter, perhaps, or a ranch hand looking for work. Such men passed through Copper Creek regularly, following the seasons and the cattle drives. Eleanor turned back to her work, not wanting to give Margaret another reason for anger. But something made her glance back, and she found the rider had stopped at their gate. He sat motionless, seeming to study the small homestead with its struggling garden and weathered buildings. "What are you gawking at?" Margaret had materialized beside her, moving with the silent speed she employed when looking for fault. Her eyes narrowed as she spotted the rider. "Get inside, now!" But before Eleanor could obey, Margaret's hand shot out, gripping her arm with bruising force. "On second thought, finish the wash. And if that saddle tramp comes sniffing around, you don't say a word to him. You hear? Not one word." Eleanor nodded, but Margaret wasn't satisfied with the silent compliance. Her grip tightened, nails digging through the thin fabric of Eleanor's sleeve. "I asked if you heard me, girl." "Yes, ma'am," Eleanor whispered. "Yes, what?" "Yes, ma'am. I won't speak to him." Margaret released her with a shove that sent Eleanor stumbling toward the wash tub. But the older woman's attention was clearly divided now. her eyes tracking the rider who still hadn't moved from his position at the gate. Eleanor bent over the washtub, her arms plunging into the harsh lye water that sent fresh fire through her damaged hands. She kept her head down, but her peripheral vision allowed her to track what was happening. The rider had dismounted and was leading his horse through the gate, his movements deliberate and unhurried. As he drew closer, Eleanor risked a quick glance and felt her breath catch. He was younger than she'd expected, perhaps in his late 20s, with the kind of face that had been carved by wind and weather into something hard but not unkind. Dark hair showed beneath his hat, and his eyes, she could see them now, were the deep blue of winter twilight. "Afternoon, ma'am," he said, touching the brim of his hat as he addressed Margaret. His voice was deep and measured, carrying the slight drawl of Texas or somewhere thereabouts. "I'm looking for water for my horse, if you could spare it." Margaret's posture shifted, and Eleanor recognized the calculating look that crossed her stepmother's face. A younger man, traveling alone, well-armed and well-mounted. He might have money. "Of course," Margaret said, her voice honey-sweet in a way that made Eleanor's skin crawl. "The well's right there. Help yourself." She gestured graciously, then added, "I'm Mrs. Margaret Blackwood. This is my late husband's property." The man nodded politely, but his eyes had already moved past Margaret, settling on Eleanor. She kept her gaze fixed on the washing, scrubbing at a shirt that was already clean, aware of every movement in her peripheral vision. "Mighty hot for such hard work," he observed, still looking at Eleanor. Margaret's sweetness curdled instantly. "The girl's lazy, has to be kept at it or nothing would get done around here." She moved to block his view of Eleanor, her body language possessive and threatening. "Irish blood. You know, her mother was a shanty Irish woman who trapped my poor husband into marriage, died birthing her, and left him with this burden." Eleanor's hands stilled in the water, the casual cruelty of the lie. Her mother had been German, not Irish, and had died of fever when Eleanor was 3 hurt worse than any blow. But she'd learned not to correct Margaret's stories. The last time she'd tried, she'd gone 3 days without food. "That's so?" The man's voice was neutral, but something in it made Eleanor risk another glance. He was looking at Margaret now, and his expression was unreadable as carved stone. He moved to the well, drawing water for his horse with efficient movements. The animal was a beautiful bay, well cared for despite the dust of travel. As it drank, the man's gaze wandered back to Eleanor, taking in details, her too thin frame, the bruises on her arms, the way she hunched over the washtub as if trying to disappear. Margaret noticed his attention and her voice sharpened. "Eleanor, stop dawdling! That wash should have been done an hour ago." Eleanor scrubbed harder, but her exhaustion made her clumsy. The soap slipped from her raw hands, and as she lunged to catch it, she knocked against the tub. Water sloshed over the side, soaking the front of her dress and splashing onto the ground. Margaret's face contorted with rage. "You stupid, clumsy cow!" She moved faster than Eleanor could react, her hand connecting with the side of Eleanor's head hard enough to send her sprawling. "Look what you've done! Wasted water in a drought!" Eleanor's vision swam as she tried to push herself up from the dirt. She could taste blood where her teeth had cut the inside of her cheek. But before she could rise, Margaret was on her, grabbing a handful of her hair and yanking her head back. "Worthless!" Margaret's hand rose again. "Absolutely worthless. I should have sold you to that Mexican trader when he offered. At least then you'd be some use to someone." The blow never landed. A strong hand caught Margaret's wrist in mid-swing, stopping it cold. The cowboy stood there, his grip firm but not painful, his expression still carved from stone. "I believe that's enough, ma'am," he said quietly. Margaret's face went white, then red. "How dare you? This is my property. The girl is mine to discipline as I see fit." "Nobody owns anybody," the cowboy replied, still in that same quiet tone. "Leastways, not since the war ended." Margaret wrenched her arm free, her chest heaving with fury. "Get off my land! Get out before I have the sheriff on you!" The cowboy didn't move. His eyes were fixed on Eleanor, who had managed to sit up but remained on the ground. One hand pressed to her throbbing head. A thin trickle of blood ran from the corner of her mouth. "Don't hurt her," he said suddenly, his voice carrying an odd note. Then, as if the words were pulled from him, "Sell her to me." The silence that followed was absolute. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. Eleanor's eyes widened in shock, while Margaret's face went through a series of expressions: outrage, confusion, and then, terribly, calculation. "What did you say?" Margaret's voice was different now. "Careful." The cowboy reached into his vest and pulled out a leather wallet. "You said you should have sold her to a trader. I'm making you a better offer. Name your price." Eleanor felt the world tilt on its axis. This couldn't be happening. People didn't buy and sell other people, not anymore, not in 1870. But Margaret was looking at the wallet with undisguised greed, and the cowboy's face was deadly serious. "You're insane," Margaret said, but there was no conviction in it. "Maybe—" He opened the wallet, revealing more bills than Eleanor had ever seen in one place. "But I'm also offering you a solution to your burden. You clearly don't want her here. I'm willing to take her off your hands." This is illegal," Margaret protested weakly, her eyes never leaving the money. "Is it?" The cowboy's voice was mild. "Way I see it, I'm offering to compensate you for years of room and board you've provided for an orphan. Nothing illegal about that. She's of age, free to go where she pleases. I'm just making it worth your while to let her go." Eleanor found her voice at last. "No," it came out as a croak. "You can't. I'm not—" "Shut up," Margaret snapped, then turned back to the cowboy. "How much?" He named a sum that made Margaret's eyes go wide. It was more than the homestead was worth, more than Thomas Hartley had ever seen in his lifetime. "That's generous," Margaret managed. "It's fair," the cowboy corrected, "for taking on the responsibility of her care. Do we have a deal?" Margaret's greed warred with her suspicion. "Why? Why would you pay so much for a worthless girl who can barely do a day's work?" The cowboy's eyes never left Eleanor's face as he answered. "Because I've got a ranch needs tending, and I need help. Because I believe in fair wages for fair work. And because—" He paused, then continued in a harder voice. "Because I don't hold with beating folks who can't fight back." Margaret bristled. "I have every right—" "You have no rights over her." He cut her off. "Not really, but I'm willing to pay you to recognize that fact peacefully." The negotiation that followed was surreal. Eleanor watched from the ground, unable to process what was happening as Margaret haggled over her worth like she was livestock at auction. Part of her wanted to run, to flee into the vast prairie and take her chances with the coyotes and rattlesnakes. But a larger part was simply too tired, too beaten down to do anything but watch her fate being decided by others. Finally, they reached an agreement. The cowboy counted out bills with steady hands while Margaret watched with fevered eyes. When the last bill was handed over, Margaret stuffed them into her bodice and stepped back. "She's yours," she said flatly. "Good riddance." The cowboy nodded, then moved to Eleanor, crouching down to her level. For the first time, she got a clear look at his face. Weather-beaten, yes, but younger than the hard line suggested. His eyes, up close, held something she couldn't identify. Not pity, exactly, but a kind of understanding that made her throat tight. "Can you stand?" he asked gently. Eleanor nodded, though she wasn't sure it was true. He offered his hand, and after a moment's hesitation, she took it. His palm was calloused, but his grip was careful as he helped her to her feet. "Get your things," he said. "We're leaving." "I don't—" Eleanor's voice failed her. She cleared her throat and tried again. "I don't have much. Whatever you have, then—" Margaret watched with satisfaction as Eleanor stumbled toward the cabin. "Don't take anything that doesn't belong to you," she called. "The clothes on your back are charity enough." Inside the cabin, Eleanor moved like a sleepwalker. Her few possessions, a hairbrush that had been her mother's, her father's Bible, a spare dress even more patched than the one she wore, fit into a small flour sack. She paused at her father's room, now Margaret's, and felt a wave of grief so strong it nearly brought her to her knees. When she emerged, the cowboy had his horse saddled and ready. He took her pathetic bundle and secured it to the saddle, then turned to help her mount. Eleanor had ridden before, in what seemed like another lifetime, but never in a dress, never on such a tall horse. "Put your foot here," he instructed, guiding her. "That's it, hold tight." He swung up behind her with easy grace, his arms coming around her to take the reins. Eleanor sat rigid, acutely aware of this stranger's proximity, of the solid warmth of him at her back. "What's your name?" she asked as he turned the horse toward the gate. "Jake," he said. "Jake Mitchell. And you're Eleanor." She nodded, not trusting her voice. As they rode away from the only home she'd known for the past 5 years, she didn't look back, but she could feel Margaret's eyes on them, could imagine the satisfied smirk on her stepmother's face. The sun was beginning its descent toward the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and red. Dust rose beneath the horses' hooves, and the familiar landscape of Copper Creek began to fall away behind them. Eleanor had no idea where they were going, no idea what awaited her. She'd simply traded one uncertain fate for another. But as they rode into the vastness of the prairie, with the wind carrying away the last sounds of Margaret's domain, Eleanor felt something she hadn't experienced in months, the faintest stirring of hope. It was fragile as a newborn bird, and just as likely to die, but it was there, nestled in her chest like a secret. She was leaving. Whatever came next, she was finally leaving. And for now, that was enough. The transaction played out like a grotesque parody of a livestock sale. Margaret stood on the porch, her eyes glittering with avarice as she watched Jake Mitchell count out the bills. Her fingers twitched with each one, as if she could already feel them in her grasp. 200, Jake said, laying the bills on the porch rail. 300, 400. Eleanor remained on the ground where she'd fallen, her mind struggling to comprehend what was happening. The sum being counted was more than her father had made in 2 years of back-breaking work in the mine. More than most folks in Copper Creek would see in a lifetime. 500, Jake continued, his voice steady. 600. Margaret's breathing had quickened. That's a considerable sum. Mr. Mitchell. It's what I'm offering, he replied simply, adding more bills to the pile. When he reached $800, he stopped and looked Margaret in the eye. This should cover any claim you think you have on her, plus compensation for your troubles. Margaret's hand darted out like a striking snake, snatching up the money before he could change his mind. She counted it quickly, her lips moving silently, then stuffed it into her bodice with indecent haste. "Well then," she said, attempting to regain some dignity, "I suppose that concludes our business. The girl is yours to deal with as you see fit." She paused, then added with cruel satisfaction, "Though I warn you, she's more trouble than she's worth. Lazy, clumsy, and prone to wild tales. Her father spoiled her, filled her head with foolish notions." Jake's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "I'll be the judge of that, ma'am." Eleanor watched this exchange as if from a great distance. Part of her wanted to protest, to declare that she wasn't property to be bought and sold like a milk cow. But another part, the part that had endured months of Margaret's cruelty, recognized this for what it might be: escape. "Girl," Margaret barked, "get up! You're his problem now." Jake moved then, stepping between Margaret and Eleanor with deliberate calm. "Her name is Eleanor," he said quietly, "and I'll thank you to use it." Margaret's face flushed. "Don't presume to tell me. The transaction is complete." Jake cut her off. "Which means you have no further say in the matter." He turned to Eleanor, his expression softening. "Miss Hartley, can you stand?" The use of her proper name, the respectful address, nearly undid her. When was the last time anyone had spoken to her with basic courtesy? She nodded, though her legs felt like water, and accepted the hand he offered. His grip was firm but gentle. and he waited patiently while she found her balance. "You'll need your belongings," he said. "She takes nothing but what she's wearing," Margaret interjected. "Everything in that house was bought with my late husband's money." Jake's eyes hardened. "The lady will take her personal effects, unless you'd like to renegotiate our arrangement." The threat was subtle but clear. Margaret, clutching the bills hidden in her bodice, backed down with ill grace. "5 minutes," she spat. "Take what's yours and get out." Eleanor moved toward the cabin on unsteady legs, acutely aware of both sets of eyes on her. Inside, the familiar space felt foreign, as if she were already a stranger here. She climbed the ladder to the loft where she slept, each rung an effort. Her possessions were pitifully few. The extra dress, patched so many times it was more thread than original fabric. Her mother's silver hairbrush, hidden beneath a loose floorboard. The one thing of value Margaret hadn't found, her father's Bible. Its leather cover worn soft with handling. A small daguerreotype of her parents on their wedding day. Her father young and hopeful. Her mother beautiful in a simple dress. She wrapped these treasures in her spare shawl, creating a small bundle. On impulse, she grabbed the thin blanket from her cot. It had been her father's, and still carried the faint scent of his pipe tobacco. When she descended, Jake was waiting by his horse, having ignored Margaret's demands that he wait outside the property line. He took her bundle without comment, securing it carefully to his saddle. The horse, a beautiful bay with intelligent eyes, stood quietly, as if sensing the gravity of the moment. "You'll regret this," Margaret called from the porch. "Mark my words, Mr. Mitchell. That girl will bring you nothing but trouble. She's cursed, just like her mother was. Bad blood always tells." Jake didn't respond. He helped Eleanor mount the horse, his hands steady at her waist as he lifted her into the saddle. The world looked different from this height, larger and more frightening. She gripped the saddle horn with white knuckles as Jake swung up behind her. "Ready?" he asked quietly, his breath warm against her ear. She nodded, not trusting her voice. With a gentle nudge, he set the horse in motion, and they began to move away from the only home Eleanor had known for the past 5 years. As they passed through the gate, Eleanor couldn't resist one look back. Margaret stood on the porch, no longer the towering figure of authority, but a diminished woman clutching her ill-gotten gains. The cabin looked smaller than Eleanor remembered, meaner. The garden she'd tended with such care was already wilting in the afternoon heat. Then Jake turned the horse onto the main road, and the homestead disappeared behind a rise. Just like that, one life ended and another began. They rode in silence for a time. The only sounds, the steady clop of hooves and the whisper of wind through the grass. Eleanor held herself rigid, afraid to lean back against this stranger who had just purchased her like property. Her mind churned with questions and fears. Who was this man? What did he want with her? What kind of person bought another human being, even to save them? As if sensing her thoughts, Jake spoke. "I know this is strange. Hell, it's strange for me too, but I want you to know, you're not property. Not to me, not to anyone. What happened back there?" He paused, seeming to search for words. "Sometimes you have to speak in a language folks understand. Your stepmother understands money, so that's what I used." "But you paid for me," Eleanor said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I paid to get you away from her," he corrected. "There's a difference. Soon as we get to town, we'll see the circuit judge. Make it all legal and proper. You'll be free to go wherever you want. Do whatever you choose. And if I choose to leave, then I'll see you get wherever you're going safely." His voice was matter-of-fact. "Though I'm hoping you'll at least hear me out first. I do have a proposition for you, but it's got nothing to do with what you might be thinking." Eleanor felt some of the tension leave her shoulders. "What kind of proposition?" "Fair work for fair wages," he said. "I've got a ranch about 2 days' ride from here. Nothing fancy, but it's growing. Problem is, I can't run it alone anymore. I need someone who can help with the house, the garden, maybe help with the books. I noticed you can read and write." "My father taught me," Eleanor said softly. He did you a service. Not many folks out here have those skills. Jake guided the horse around a deep rut in the road. I'm offering you a job. Miss Hartley, $1 a day plus room and board. You work for me for 6 months. And if either of us is unhappy with the arrangement, you're free to go with money in your pocket. If it works out, we can discuss a more permanent arrangement. $1 a day. Eleanor couldn't hide her shock. It was more than most cowboys made, certainly more than any woman could expect to earn. It's hard work, Jake warned. The ranch is isolated. Nearest neighbor is 5 miles off, and I'll be honest, I'm not the easiest man to work for. I expect things done right, and I can be particular about how I want them done. I'm used to hard work, Eleanor said quietly. What that woman had you doing wasn't work. It was slavery. His voice hardened. You'll work hard at the ranch, but you'll be treated fair, regular meals, decent bed, Sundays off, and nobody will ever raise a hand to you again. The fierce protectiveness in his voice made Eleanor's throat tight. She blinked hard, refusing to cry. Not now, not when she needed to stay strong and clear-headed. They were approaching the outskirts of Copper Creek proper now. The sun was beginning its descent, painting the scattered buildings in shades of gold and amber. People on the street turned to stare as they passed. The mysterious cowboy who'd been seen heading toward the Blackwood place, now returning with Eleanor Hartley riding in front of him. Eleanor could imagine the gossip that would spread like wildfire. By tomorrow, everyone in town would have their own version of what had happened. She kept her eyes fixed straight ahead, her chin raised despite the burning in her cheeks. Jake guided the horse to the small building that served as both courthouse and jail. Judge Theodore Brennan held court here twice a month, and by lucky chance, this was one of his days. Jake dismounted first, then helped Eleanor down, his hands lingering at her waist until he was sure she was steady. Let's make this official, he said. Inside. Judge Brennan, a thin man with intelligent eyes behind wire spectacles, listened to Jake's carefully worded explanation. A contract of employment. He called it. A formal agreement that would give Eleanor the legal status of a free woman employed by the Mitchell Ranch. This is highly irregular, the judge said, peering at them over his spectacles. Miss Hartley, are you entering into this agreement of your own free will? Eleanor felt both men's eyes on her. This was her chance to speak up, to refuse, to choose a different path. But where would she go? What would she do? At least Jake Mitchell was offering her honest work and wages. It was more than she'd had this morning. Yes, Your Honor, she said clearly. I am. The judge prepared the papers with careful precision. As Eleanor watched him write, she felt as if she were watching her old life being officially ended, line by line. When it came time to sign, her hand trembled only slightly. There, Judge Brennan said, sanding the ink dry. Miss Hartley, you are now legally employed by Mr. Mitchell. The terms are as stated, 6 months initial employment, with wages of $1 per day, plus room and board. Either party may terminate the agreement with 2 weeks' notice. He handed her a copy of the document. Keep this safe. It's your proof of employment and your protection under the law. Eleanor folded the paper carefully and tucked it inside her bodice, next to her heart. It felt strange there, this formal declaration of her freedom. Outside, the sun had dropped lower, and Jake frowned at the sky. We'll need to stay in town tonight. Can't make good time in the dark, and you need a decent meal and rest before we travel. He led the way to the boarding house run by Mrs. Patterson, a widow who kept a respectable establishment. Eleanor hung back as Jake negotiated for rooms. 2 of them, he specified firmly, causing Mrs. Patterson's raised eyebrows to lower somewhat. Eleanor Hartley. The older woman peered around Jake to get a better look. Land's sakes, child. What are you doing here, and looking like... She trailed off, taking in Eleanor's thin frame and worn appearance. Miss Hartley is now employed at my ranch, Jake said smoothly. We'll be heading out in the morning. but she needs a room for tonight and a hot meal if you've got one. Mrs. Patterson's sharp eyes took in the whole situation in a glance. Eleanor's bruised face, her trembling hands, the protective way Jake positioned himself. "Of course," she said, her voice gentling. "I've got beef stew on the stove and fresh bread. Eleanor, honey, you come with me. I'll show you to your room." Eleanor followed the older woman up the narrow stairs, grateful for the familiar kindness in her voice. The room was small but clean, with a real bed instead of a straw-filled loft, and a washstand with fresh water. "You get yourself cleaned up." "Mrs." Patterson said, her hands gentle on Eleanor's shoulders. "I'll bring up some hot water and—" She paused, studying Eleanor's ragged dress. "I think I have something that might fit you better. My daughter left some things when she married and moved to Denver. I couldn't—" Eleanor began, but Mrs. Patterson cut her off. "Nonsense. That Mitchell boy paid in advance, and generously too. Told me to see you had everything you needed." She squeezed Eleanor's shoulders gently. "Whatever happened, honey, you're safe now. Jake Mitchell's a good man. A bit rough around the edges maybe, but good where it counts." After she left, Eleanor stood in the middle of the room, overwhelmed by the sudden kindness. A real bed, clean water, the promise of a hot meal. Such simple things, but after months of deprivation, they seemed like unimaginable luxuries. She washed carefully, wincing as the soap stung her raw hands. In the mirror above the washstand, a stranger looked back, hollow cheeks, shadowed eyes, a purple bruise blooming along her jaw. But there was something else there too, something she hadn't seen in months, a spark of something that might have been hope. "Mrs. Patterson returned with a simple blue dress, worn but clean and roughly Eleanor's size. "This should do for traveling," she said briskly. "Now come down when you're ready. That stew won't keep forever." The dress fit reasonably well, though it hung loose on her too thin frame. Eleanor smoothed the skirt with careful hands, marveling at the feeling of clean fabric against her skin. When she descended to the dining room, she found Jake already there, hat off, studying a map spread on the table. He looked up as she entered, and something flickered in his eyes. "Better?" he asked simply. Eleanor nodded, taking the seat across from him. "Mrs." Patterson bustled in with 2 bowls of stew and a basket of bread still warm from the oven. The smell made Eleanor's stomach clench with hunger, but she forced herself to eat slowly, mindful of months of sparse meals. Jake seemed to understand, keeping the conversation light and sporadic. He pointed out their route on the map, showing her the location of his ranch in the foothills of the mountains. As they ate, other boarders drifted in, casting curious glances their way. Eleanor kept her eyes on her food, but she could feel their speculation like a physical weight. When the meal was finished, Jake pushed back from the table. "Get some rest," he advised. "We'll leave at first light. It's a long ride, and we'll want to make good time." Eleanor rose to return to her room, then paused. "Mr. Mitchell?" "Jake," he corrected. "Jake." The name felt foreign on her tongue. "Why did you do it, really?" He was quiet for a long moment, his weathered face unreadable. Then he said, "My mother died when I was 12. My father, he changed after that, took to drinking, took to using his fists when the drinking wasn't enough. I lived like that for 3 years before I was big enough to fight back and leave." He met her eyes steadily. "I know what it's like to be trapped, Miss Hartley, to have folks with power over you use that power wrong. If I can stop that happening to someone else." He shrugged. "Well, seemed like the right thing to do." Eleanor felt her throat close with emotion. She managed a nod, then fled to the safety of her room before the tears could fall. Once there, she sat on the edge of the bed, the first real bed she'd had in months, and let them come. Not tears of sadness or fear, but of relief so profound it shook her to her bones. She was free. Whatever tomorrow brought, whatever challenges awaited at Jake Mitchell's ranch, She was free. The paper tucked against her heart proved it. But more than that, the simple kindness of a stranger had made it real. As she lay down on the soft mattress, pulling a clean blanket up to her chin, Eleanor offered up a prayer of gratitude for Jake Mitchell and his timely arrival, for Mrs. Patterson's motherly care, for the meal in her belly and the roof over her head, for the first day in 6 months that hadn't ended with bruises or cruel words. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges, a new life, a new place, new expectations to meet. But tonight, for the first time in longer than she could remember, Eleanor Hartley fell asleep without fear. Dawn broke gray and cool as they left Copper Creek behind, the town still sleeping except for a few early risers who watched their departure with curious eyes. Eleanor sat in front of Jake on his bay horse, her small bundle of possessions tied securely behind the saddle. The blue dress Mrs. Patterson had given her was practical for riding, and she'd braided her hair tightly to keep it from tangling in the wind. The first hours passed in relative silence, broken only by Jake's occasional comments about landmarks or directions. The landscape gradually changed as they traveled north and west, the flat prairie giving way to rolling hills dotted with juniper and sage. The air grew cooler, carrying the scent of pine from distant mountains. "We'll stop to rest the horse in an hour or so," Jake said as they crested a particularly steep hill. "There's a creek up ahead with good water." Eleanor nodded, grateful for the promised respite. She wasn't accustomed to long hours in the saddle, and her body ached in places she'd forgotten existed, but she wouldn't complain. This discomfort was nothing compared to the daily misery she'd left behind. As they rode, she found herself stealing glances at the landscape. It was beautiful in a wild, untamed way that spoke to something deep in her soul. Eagles circled overhead, their cries echoing across the vast space. In the distance, she could see the purple shadows of mountains, their peaks still crowned with snow despite the advancing spring. "That's where we're headed," Jake said, following her gaze. "My ranch sits in the foothills, right where the plains meet the mountains. Best of both worlds, good grazing land and protection from the worst of the winter storms." "How long have you had it?" Eleanor ventured, curious despite herself. "Going on 4 years now. Started with just a quarter section and a handful of cattle. Now I've got a full section, 640 acres, and near about 200 head. There was quiet pride in his voice. "It's not the biggest spread in the territory, but it's mine. Worked for every acre, every animal." They reached the promised creek by mid-morning. Jake dismounted first, then helped Eleanor down, his hands steady at her waist. Her legs nearly buckled when they hit the ground, muscles cramped from the unfamiliar position. "Walk around a bit," Jake advised, leading his horse to the water. "Gets easier with time." Eleanor did as suggested, moving stiffly along the creek bank. The water ran clear and cold, bubbling over smooth stones. Cottonwoods provided shade, their leaves whispering secrets to the wind. She knelt carefully and cupped water in her hands, drinking deeply. "Hungry?" Jake had unpacked provisions from his saddlebags, cold biscuits, dried beef, and dried apples. Simple fare, but Eleanor accepted it gratefully. They ate in companionable silence, watching the horse graze on the sweet grass near the water. A pair of deer emerged from the trees upstream, froze at the sight of them, then bounded away with white tails flashing. "It's beautiful here," Eleanor said softly. "Wait till you see the ranch." Jake replied, "Different kind of beautiful, maybe, but it grows on you." He paused, then added, "I should warn you, it's isolated. Nearest neighbor is the Hendersons, about 5 miles east. Town's a full day's ride. It can get lonely." Eleanor almost laughed at that. Lonely? After months of wishing she could escape Margaret's constant criticism and cruelty? "I don't mind being alone," she said honestly. Jake studied her with those steady blue eyes. "There's alone and there's lonely. They're not always the same thing." They mounted up again and continued their journey. The afternoon sun beat down warmly, and Eleanor found herself relaxing incrementally. Jake was a comfortable traveling companion, quiet but not forbidding. alert to their surroundings, but not tense. Occasionally, he'd point out features of the landscape or share bits of information about the area. "That ridge there marks the eastern boundary of my land," he said as they approached a long line of red rocks. "Everything from here to the mountains is Mitchell Range." Eleanor looked around with new interest. The land was rougher here, with more trees and varied terrain. She could see why it would make good ranching country. Plenty of grass in the valleys, water from mountain streams, natural windbreaks and shelter. As the sun began its descent toward the western peaks, Jake guided the horse up a final rise. "There," he said simply. Home. Eleanor's breath caught. Nestled in a natural bowl of land sat a collection of buildings, a log cabin with a stone chimney, a barn, several corrals, and what looked like a bunkhouse. Smoke rose from the cabin's chimney, and she could see cattle dotting the nearby hillsides. It wasn't grand, but it was solid and real and spoke of hard work and determination. "It's wonderful," she breathed. She felt rather than saw Jake smile. "Glad you think so. Come on, let's get you settled." As they descended toward the ranch, a figure emerged from the barn. A tall, lean man with graying hair and a pronounced limp. He raised a hand in greeting, then did a double-take when he spotted Eleanor. "That's Sam," Jake explained. "He's been with me since the beginning. Good man, best hand with horses I've ever seen. Lost part of his foot to frostbite years back, so he can't do the heavy riding anymore. But he keeps things running when I'm gone." They rode into the yard, and Sam approached, his weathered face creased with curiosity. "Boss," he said by way of greeting, his eyes sliding to Eleanor with barely concealed interest. "Sam, this is Miss Eleanor Hartley. She'll be working here, helping with the house and such." Eleanor. Sam Morrison. Sam touched his hat brim politely. "Ma'am, welcome to the Double M." "Thank you," Eleanor managed, suddenly shy. It had been so long since she'd had to interact with strangers in any normal capacity. Jake dismounted and helped her down. "Sam, would you see to Banner? Miss Hartley's had a long day." "Sure thing, boss." Sam took the horse's reins, but his eyes remained curious. Eleanor could practically see the questions bubbling up, but he was too polite or too well trained to ask them. Jake led Eleanor toward the cabin. "It's not fancy," he warned as he opened the door. "Bachelor quarters, but it's sound and warm." Eleanor stepped inside and felt immediately at home. The main room was large and open, with a stone fireplace at one end and a kitchen area at the other. The furniture was simple but well made. A table and chairs, a rocking chair by the fire, shelves lined with books that surprised her. A ladder led to what she assumed was a loft. "Your room's through here," Jake said, leading her to a door she hadn't noticed. "Used to be a storage room, but I cleared it out when I knew you were coming." The room was small but private, with a narrow bed, a washstand, and hooks on the wall for clothes. A small window looked out toward the mountains. "Someone, Jake," she realized with surprise, had put a colorful quilt on the bed and a rag rug on the floor. "It's perfect," she said, meaning it. Jake looked pleased but tried to hide it. "Well, you get settled. Washroom's out back. I know that's not ideal, but it's what we've got. There's a hip bath in the barn if you want to heat water for a proper wash. Supper's usually around sundown. Nothing fancy. Sam and I take turns cooking, and neither of us is much good at it." "I can cook," Eleanor offered quickly. "I'd be happy to take over that duty. That'd be appreciated," Jake admitted. "Fair warning, though. The pantry's pretty basic. We get supplies once a month from town. Supplement with what we can hunt or grow." He left her to get settled, and Eleanor sat on the edge of the bed, overwhelmed again by the speed at which her life had changed. This morning she'd woken in Margaret's loft, expecting another day of drudgery and abuse. Now she was here, in this peaceful place, with a real job and wages and people who treated her with respect. She unpacked her few belongings, hanging her spare dress on a hook and placing her parents' photograph on the small shelf by the bed. Her father's Bible went under her pillow. Old habits died hard. The employment contract from Judge Brennan she folded carefully and tucked into the Bible for safekeeping. A knock on her door made her jump. "Miss Hartley?" It was Sam's voice. "Boss said to tell you there's hot water if you want to wash up before supper." "Thank you," she called back. The washroom was indeed basic, but functional. Eleanor cleaned herself as best she could, marveling at having privacy and time to do so without someone shouting at her to hurry. When she emerged, the sun was setting, painting the mountains in shades of purple and gold. She found Jake and Sam in the kitchen, attempting to put together a meal. The sight of two tough cowboys frowning over a pot of beans might have been comical if she hadn't been so nervous about her new situation. "Can I help?" she offered. Jake looked relieved. "If you're not too tired, we've got beans, salt pork, and—" He gestured helplessly at the supplies. Eleanor took over with quiet efficiency. The pantry was indeed basic, but she'd worked with less. Soon she had the beans seasoned properly, biscuits in the oven, and had even found some preserved peaches for dessert. The men watched with something approaching awe. "Ma'am, if you can cook like this regular, Jake might have to give you a raise," Sam said, tucking into his meal with enthusiasm. The compliment warmed Eleanor more than the fire. They ate companionably, Sam regaling them with stories of ranch mishaps and close calls with ornery bulls. Jake added his own dry commentary, and Eleanor found herself relaxing enough to smile and even laugh softly at some of the tales. After supper, Sam excused himself to check on the horses one last time before bed. Jake and Eleanor were left alone by the fire, a comfortable silence settling between them. "I should explain how things work here," Jake said eventually. "Sam and I are usually out with the cattle from dawn to mid-morning, then again in the afternoon. You'll have the house to yourself most of the day. I'd appreciate meals when we're here, keeping the place tidy. Maybe some mending if you're able. The garden needs attention too. We try to grow what we can to supplement supplies." "Of course," Eleanor agreed. "What about laundry?" "Monday's traditional wash day, but work it however suits you. There's a good spot by the creek for washing when the weather's fair." He paused, seeming to choose his words carefully. "I want to be clear about something. Miss Hartley, you're an employee here, not a servant. You work hard, yes, but you're treated with respect. You need something. You ask, something's not right. You say so. Understood." Eleanor nodded, throat tight with emotion. "Understood. Good. Now, I imagine you're tired. We start early here, usually up with the sun, but take tomorrow morning to get your bearings. Sam and I can fend for ourselves one more day." Eleanor rose to go to her room, then paused. "Mr. Mitchell, Jake, thank you for everything. I know what you did was unusual, expensive. I promise I'll work hard to earn it back." Jake's expression was unreadable in the firelight. "You don't owe me anything beyond honest work for honest wages. The rest, well, sometimes a man has to do what's right. Cost be damned." He stood, suddenly seeming uncomfortable with the emotion of the moment. "Sleep well, Miss Hartley." In her small room, Eleanor prepared for bed in a daze. The narrow bed with its colorful quilt felt like the height of luxury after months in a drafty loft. She could hear the distant lowing of cattle, the neigh of a horse, the creak of the cabin settling for the night. Normal sounds of a working ranch. So different from the tense silence of Margaret's house, where every footstep might herald another confrontation. As she lay in the darkness, Eleanor's mind wandered to the events of the past 2 days. It seemed impossible that her life could change so dramatically so quickly. Part of her feared she'd wake to find it all a dream, that Margaret would be standing over her demanding she get up and start her chores. But the bed was real, the quilt warm, the soft sound of wind in the pines outside her window, a lullaby of freedom. Whatever challenges tomorrow brought, whatever hard work awaited, she would meet it gladly. For the first time in 6 months, Eleanor Hartley fell asleep with hope for the future warming her heart like a carefully tended flame. The Double M Ranch had taken in a damaged soul, offering shelter and honest work and the possibility of healing. in the darkness of her new room, Eleanor whispered a prayer of gratitude, adding a special thanks for the taciturn cowboy who'd seen her suffering and chosen to act. Whatever Jake Mitchell's motives, whatever the future held, he'd given her a chance at a new life. She intended to make the most of it. The weeks that followed Eleanor's arrival at the Double M Ranch fell into a rhythm as natural as breathing. She woke each morning to the sound of roosters crowing and the low murmur of men's voices as Jake and Sam prepared for their day's work. By the time she dressed and entered the kitchen, they'd usually already grabbed cold biscuits and coffee, leaving her to the quiet sanctuary of the house. Those first mornings, she moved through the cabin like a ghost, afraid to disturb anything, afraid to make her presence too known. But gradually, as days turned to weeks, she began to make small changes. A wildflower in a jar on the table, the windows thrown open to let in fresh mountain air, the smell of real breakfast eggs when the hens were laying, flapjacks with the last of the winter preserves, fresh bread that filled the cabin with warmth. "You're spoiling us," Sam declared one morning, attacking his third flapjack with enthusiasm. "Haven't eaten this good since my mother passed. God rest her soul." Jake said less, but Eleanor noticed he'd started lingering over breakfast instead of rushing out the door. Sometimes she'd catch him watching her as she moved about the kitchen, his expression thoughtful in a way that made her cheeks warm. The work was hard but satisfying, unlike at Margaret's, where labor had been endless and thankless. Here, Eleanor could see the fruits of her efforts. The garden, neglected by two bachelors more concerned with cattle than vegetables, began to thrive under her care. She coaxed life from the soil, planting rows of beans and squash, nurturing the struggling tomato plants back to health. "My mother had a garden like this," Jake told her one evening, finding her watering the plants as the sun set. "Back in Missouri, before we came west, she'd spend hours out there, hands in the dirt, humming hymns." It was one of the few times he'd mentioned his family. Eleanor didn't press, but she treasured these small revelations, piecing together the story of the man who'd saved her. The isolation Jake had warned her about proved to be a blessing rather than a burden. After months of walking on eggshells around Margaret, the solitude of the ranch was healing. She could work at her own pace, sing if she wanted to, sit on the porch with a cup of tea and watch the eagles soar overhead. The fear that had lived in her chest for so long began to ease, though it never fully disappeared. Some days were harder than others. Thunder would roll across the mountains, and she'd find herself trembling, remembering Margaret's rages. Once, she dropped a plate while washing dishes, and the crash sent her to her knees, apologies spilling from her lips automatically. Jake had been passing through and stopped short at the sight of her. "Hey," he said softly, crouching beside her. "It's just a plate. We've got others." "I'm sorry," she whispered, hating the tears that threatened. "I'm sorry. I didn't mean—" "Eleanor." His voice was firm but kind. "Look at me." She raised her eyes to his, expecting anger, finding only concern. "It's just a plate," he repeated. "Accidents happen. You're safe here. Safe." The word wrapped around her like a blanket. She nodded, letting him help her to her feet, letting herself believe it might be true. As spring deepened toward summer, the bond between them grew in small, quiet ways. Jake started teaching her to ride properly on one of the gentler horses, a mare named Daisy with a sweet disposition and endless patience. Eleanor discovered she loved it, the freedom of movement, the partnership between horse and rider, the way the world looked different from horseback. "You're a natural," Jake observed one afternoon, watching her guide Daisy through a series of turns. "Must have good instincts." "My father let me ride sometimes," Eleanor said, patting Daisy's neck. "Before—" She trailed off, not wanting to darken the moment with sad memories. "Well, you're welcome to ride whenever you want," Jake said. "Daisy could use the exercise, and you could use the fresh air. You're looking healthier." It was true. Regular meals and honest work had begun to fill out her too thin frame. The hollows in her cheeks had softened, and her arms showed new muscle from garden work and hauling water. More than that, though, was the change in her eyes. The haunted look was fading, replaced by something that might have been contentment. Sam noticed it too. "You're good for this place," he told her one day as she helped him organize the tack room. "Good for Jake, too. Haven't seen him smile this much in all the years I've known him." Eleanor's hand stilled on the bridle she was cleaning. "He doesn't smile that much." Sam chuckled. "No, but he does it more now. Man's been alone too long, buried in work and worry. You've brought some life back to this old ranch." The comments stayed with her, warming her during the long afternoons. She found herself watching for Jake's rare smiles, treasuring them like precious gems. The way his eyes crinkled at the corners when Sam told a particularly ridiculous story. The quiet satisfaction on his face when he surveyed his land. The gentleness in his expression when he worked with the horses. One evening, a month into her stay, Jake surprised her by pulling out a fiddle after supper. "Do you mind?" he asked, almost shy. "Haven't played in a while." "Please," Eleanor said eagerly. Music had been absent from her life for so long. He played old tunes, melodies that spoke of distant homes and lost loves. His fingers were sure on the strings despite his claim of being out of practice. Sam hummed along to some of the songs, and Eleanor found herself swaying slightly, remembering evenings when her father had sung similar songs. "Do you know Shenandoah?" she asked tentatively. Jake nodded and began the haunting melody. Without thinking, Eleanor began to sing, her voice soft at first, then growing stronger. She'd always loved to sing, though Margaret had forbidden it. Now, in the safety of the Double M, the music poured from her like water from a spring. When the song ended, both men were staring at her. "Good Lord," Sam breathed. "You've got the voice of an angel, Miss—" Eleanor blushed furiously. "I'm out of practice." "Could have fooled me," Jake said quietly, his eyes intense on hers. "Would you sing another?" They made music together until the fire burned low, Jake's fiddle and Eleanor's voice weaving together in the darkening cabin. It became a regular occurrence after that. These evening concerts that pushed back the darkness and filled the ranch with something approaching joy. The day Eleanor realized she was falling in love with Jake Mitchell came suddenly and without warning. He'd been breaking a new horse, a stallion with fire in his eyes and rebellion in his heart. She'd been hanging laundry when she heard the commotion and came running, fearing the worst. Jake was in the corral, locked in a battle of wills with the magnificent animal. Dust flew as the horse bucked and twisted, but Jake stayed seated, his body moving with liquid grace, anticipating each move. When the stallion finally stilled, sides heaving, Jake leaned forward and spoke softly to him, words Eleanor couldn't hear but could feel in their gentleness. Watching him, strong yet tender, patient in his power, Eleanor felt her heart shift in her chest like a key turning in a lock. "Oh no," she thought, even as warmth flooded through her. "Oh no," because what future could there be in loving her employer? Jake had saved her. Yes, but from obligation or pity or simple human decency. He'd never indicated he saw her as anything more than a housekeeper, a helping hand. To imagine more was to court heartbreak. She turned away from the corral, returning to her laundry with shaking hands. But the feeling, once recognized, wouldn't be ignored. It colored every interaction, every shared meal, every evening of music. The way he said her name, the careful distance he maintained, respectful of her position and her past. The rare moments when their hands would brush, passing a dish or a tool, and the air would crackle with possibility. Eleanor threw herself into her work with renewed vigor, trying to exhaust the feelings out of her body. She expanded the garden, organized the pantry, mended everything that could be mended. She was polishing the rarely used good dishes when Jake found her one afternoon. "Planning a party?" he asked, amused. "They were dusty," she said defensively. "When was the last time these were used?" Jake's expression shifted, becoming distant. "My mother's dishes," he said quietly. "Haven't used them since, well, Since there was someone here who appreciated such things. Eleanor set down the plate carefully. I'm sorry, I shouldn't have. No. He stepped closer, picking up one of the delicate teacups. She would have liked knowing they were being cared for. Would have liked you, I think. The moment stretched between them, fragile as the china in his hands. Eleanor found herself holding her breath, waiting for something she couldn't name. Then Sam's voice called from outside, breaking the spell. Jake set down the teacup and stepped back. Better see what he wants, he said, his voice rougher than usual. After he left, Eleanor stood alone in the kitchen, heart racing. She pressed her hands to her cheeks, feeling the heat there. This was dangerous territory. She'd been saved from one prison. She couldn't afford to build another from unrequited feelings. But that night, when Jake played his fiddle and asked her to sing, she couldn't help the way her voice softened on the love songs, couldn't help the way her eyes sought his in the firelight. And when she caught him looking back, something unreadable in his expression, she allowed herself just a moment to imagine what it might be like if he felt even a fraction of what was growing in her heart. The stars outside were bright in the clear mountain air, and somewhere in the distance, a wolf howled its loneliness to the moon. But inside the cabin of the Double M Ranch, there was warmth and music and the tentative beginning of something that might, given time and courage, grow into love. Eleanor retired to her room that night with a heart full of dangerous hope. She knew the risk of loving a man like Jake Mitchell, proud, private, shaped by losses she was only beginning to understand. But as she lay in her narrow bed, listening to the familiar sounds of the ranch settling for the night, she couldn't regret the feeling. She'd been dead inside for so long under Margaret's cruelty. If the price of coming back to life was the risk of heartbreak, it seemed a fair trade. At least now she could feel, could hope, could dream of possibilities beyond mere survival. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges. There was talk of a drought coming, and the cattle market was uncertain. But tonight, with the memory of music still echoing in her heart and the image of Jake's rare smile warming her thoughts, Eleanor allowed herself to believe in the possibility of happiness. The Double M had given her shelter and purpose. Perhaps, in time, it might give her even more. With that thought, she drifted off to sleep, unaware that in the main room, Jake Mitchell sat staring into the dying fire, wrestling with feelings of his own. The first whispers reached the Double M on a Tuesday afternoon, carried by Will Henderson when he rode over to discuss sharing water rights during the coming dry season. Eleanor was in the garden when the men gathered by the corral, but she could hear the change in their voices, the way casual conversation turned sharp with gossip. Heard tell Jake Mitchell bought himself a woman, Will was saying, not bothering to lower his voice. Paid cash money to that Blackwood widow for her stepdaughter, like she was cattle at auction. Eleanor's hands stilled on the bean plants. Through the kitchen window, she could see Jake's shoulders tense, though his voice remained level when he responded. You heard wrong. Will, I hired Miss Hartley as a housekeeper, all legal and proper. That's not how Margaret Blackwood tells it. Will pressed. She's been in town, crying to anyone who'll listen about how you stole her dear daughter. Says you paid her off to avoid trouble with the law. Margaret Blackwood is a liar, Sam interjected hotly. That woman beat the girl half to death. Jake did what was right. Maybe so, Will said, his tone suggesting he wasn't convinced. But folks are talking, young woman living out here with 2 unmarried men. Doesn't look proper. Jake, doesn't look proper at all. Eleanor couldn't bear to hear more. She slipped inside through the back door, her cheeks burning with shame. She'd known this would happen, had dreaded it even as she'd allowed herself to grow comfortable in her new life. The world beyond the ranch boundaries hadn't forgotten her existence, and now judgment was coming to roost. That evening at supper, Jake was quieter than usual. Eleanor served the meal venison stew with fresh biscuits, keeping her eyes downcast. The easy camaraderie of recent weeks had evaporated, replaced by a tension that made every clink of silverware sound like an accusation. The Hendersons are having a barn dance Saturday week, Jake said finally. Whole county's invited. I think we should go. Eleanor's head snapped up. We? All of us, Jake clarified, his jaw set in a way she'd come to recognize as stubborn determination. Let folks see there's nothing improper here. You're an employee of the Double M. Nothing to hide. Jake, Sam started warningly. No, Jake cut him off. I won't have Eleanor made to feel ashamed when she's done nothing wrong. We'll go. We'll be neighborly. And folks can think what they want. Eleanor wanted to protest, to say she'd rather stay hidden at the ranch than face the judgment of the community. But something in Jake's expression, protective and fierce, made her swallow her objections. The days leading up to the barn dance were tense. More neighbors found excuses to drop by the ranch, their real purpose transparently obvious as they craned their necks trying to catch a glimpse of Eleanor. Some were merely curious, but others carried an uglier intent. Thursday brought Thomas Garrett, a widower with a reputation for rough handling of both horses and women. He'd tried to court Margaret Blackwood before she'd latched onto Thomas Hartley, and now he circled the ranch house like a wolf scenting prey. Heard you got yourself a new arrangement. Mitchell, Garrett said, his smile showing too many teeth. Must be nice, having a pretty young thing to warm your bed. Eleanor, collecting eggs nearby, saw Jake's hands clench into fists. Miss Hartley is my employee, he said, each word precise as a bullet. She has her own room, earns honest wages, and is treated with respect. Any man who suggests otherwise will answer to me. Garrett laughed, an ugly sound. No need to get territorial. Mitchell, just saying if you get tired of the arrangement, I might be interested in taking her off your hands. For the right price. The basket of eggs slipped from Eleanor's numb fingers, shells cracking on the hard ground. Both men turned at the sound, and she felt exposed, pinned by Garrett's leering gaze. Jake moved then, placing himself between Eleanor and Garrett with deliberate intent. Get off my land, he said quietly. And if I hear you've been spreading filth about Miss Hartley, you'll regret it. Garrett left, but his parting look at Eleanor promised this wasn't over. She cleaned up the broken eggs with shaking hands while Jake stood guard, his presence both comforting and a reminder of how precarious her position truly was. Friday brought a different kind of visitor. Mary Henderson, Will's wife, arrived in their wagon with her daughter Sarah. Eleanor watched from the window, uncertain whether to hide or face whatever judgment was coming. Eleanor Hartley, Mary called, her voice carrying the authority of a woman used to managing a large family. I know you're in there. Come out and talk to a neighbor like a civilized person. Eleanor emerged slowly, wiping flour-dusted hands on her apron. Mary Henderson was a formidable woman, broad-shouldered and straight-backed, with shrewd eyes that missed nothing. Ma'am, Eleanor said cautiously. Mary studied her for a long moment, taking in everything from her neatly braided hair to her mended but clean dress. You look better than when I last saw you in town, she said finally. Healthier. Thank you. My Will came home full of gossip, Mary continued briskly. Men are worse than hens sometimes, but I prefer to judge for myself. She paused, then added more gently. I remember your father. Good man. Shame what happened after. Eleanor's throat tightened. Yes, ma'am. Are you being treated well here? Mary asked directly. Truth now. If Jake Mitchell or Sam Morrison have been improper in any way. No, Eleanor interrupted, then blushed at her vehemence. No, ma'am. They've been nothing but respectful, Mr. Mitchell saved me from a bad situation. I work for fair wages. Have my own room, my own privacy. It's all proper. Mary nodded slowly. That's what I thought. Jake's got too much honor to take advantage. And Sam's a decent sort. She gestured to her daughter. Sarah's about your age. Must get lonely out here with just the men for company. I don't mind the quiet, Eleanor said honestly. Still, a young woman needs friends. You'll come to the dance Saturday. No arguments. Sarah needs someone sensible to talk to instead of just the Simpson girls with their empty heads and gossip. Sarah, a pretty blonde with her mother's direct gaze, smiled shyly at Eleanor. "I'd like that," she said. "Maybe you could teach me some of those garden tricks Ma says you know." Eleanor found herself smiling back, the first genuine smile she'd given a stranger in months. "I'd be happy to." After the Hendersons left, Jake found Eleanor in the kitchen, kneading bread with perhaps more force than necessary. "That was good," he said. "Mary Henderson's opinion carries weight. If she approves, others will follow." "And if they don't?" Eleanor asked, not looking up from her work. Jake was quiet for a moment. "Then they'll have to deal with me." The fierce protectiveness in his voice made her hands still. She looked up to find him watching her with an expression that made her heart race. "I won't let anyone hurt you," he said softly. "Not with words, not with hands. Never again. You can't fight the whole county for me." Eleanor whispered. "Watch me," he replied, and left before she could respond. Saturday dawned clear and warm. Eleanor dressed in her better dress, the blue one Mrs. Patterson had given her, carefully cleaned and pressed. She braided her hair more elaborately than usual and pinched her cheeks for color, trying not to think about why she cared so much about her appearance. Jake emerged from his room in clothes she'd never seen: dark trousers, a clean white shirt, a vest that emphasized his broad shoulders. He'd shaved carefully and attempted to tame his usually unruly hair. The transformation was striking. "You clean up well," Sam observed with a grin. He too had made an effort, though he'd drawn the line at pomade. "We should go," Jake said, but Eleanor caught him looking at her, something warm in his gaze before he turned away. The ride to the Henderson ranch was accomplished mostly in silence, Eleanor riding Daisy while the men flanked her protectively. As they approached, they could hear music and laughter carrying on the evening air. Lanterns hung from the trees, and couples were already dancing in the cleared area before the barn. Their arrival caused a ripple of attention. Conversations paused, heads turned, and Eleanor felt the weight of dozens of eyes assessing her. She lifted her chin, drawing on reserves of courage she'd built over the past months. Mary Henderson bustled over immediately. "Eleanor, perfect timing. Come meet some of the other ladies. Jake, Sam, Will's got beer by the barn." Eleanor allowed herself to be led away, though she felt Jake's reluctance to let her go. Mary introduced her to a group of women with varying degrees of warmth. Some were genuinely welcoming, others coolly polite, and a few openly hostile. "So you're the girl Jake Mitchell bought?" said Constance Simpson, her voice carrying despite its sweetness. "How unusual." "Mr. Mitchell hired me as a housekeeper," Eleanor corrected quietly. "It's honest work." "Of course it is." "Dear," Constance purred, though one wonders what kind of housekeeping requires living arrangements quite so intimate. "That's enough. Constance," Mary Henderson said sharply. "If you can't be civil, go gossip elsewhere." Constance flounced off, but the damage was done. Eleanor could feel the speculation, the judgment, the whispers that followed her movement. She escaped to the refreshment table, hands shaking as she poured herself cider. "Don't let them bother you," Sarah Henderson said, appearing at her elbow. "Constance is jealous because she's been trying to catch Jake Mitchell's eye for 2 years. The fact that he's never given her a second glance drives her mad." Eleanor nearly choked on her cider. "I'm sure that has nothing to do with me." Sarah gave her a knowing look. "If you say so. Come on, let's get some air." They walked to the edge of the lantern light, where the music was softer and the crowd thinner. Eleanor began to relax, enjoying Sarah's easy chatter about ranch life and local personalities. She was laughing at a story about the Hendersons' ornery rooster when a hand fell on her shoulder. She spun, fear spiking through her before she recognized Thomas Garrett. His breath stank of whiskey, and his grip was too tight. "There's the pretty bird," he slurred. "How about a dance?" "No, thank you," Eleanor said, trying to step back, but his hand tightened. "Come now, don't be unfriendly. Unless Mitchell's already staked his claim?" His other hand reached for her waist. Eleanor reacted instinctively. stomping hard on his foot and wrenching away. But Garrett lunged after her. Cursing, she stumbled, certain she was about to fall, when strong arms caught her. "I believe the lady said no," Jake said, setting Eleanor gently aside before turning to face Garrett. The music had stopped. A circle formed around them as Garrett squared up, fists raised. "Been wanting to do this for a while? Mitchell, think you're better than everyone else?" Jake didn't respond, just shifted into a fighter's stance with practiced ease. The fight was brief but vicious. Garrett had size and drunken fury, but Jake had skill and cold precision. When Garrett finally stayed down, blood streaming from his nose, Jake turned to address the watching crowd. "Let me make something clear," he said, his voice carrying in the sudden silence. "Eleanor Hartley is under my protection. Any man who treats her with disrespect will answer to me. Any woman who spreads lies about her will find themselves unwelcome at the Double M. She's a good woman who's been through hard times, and she deserves better than your gossip and judgment." He held out his hand to Eleanor. "Would you honor me with a dance, Miss Hartley?" Eleanor's heart hammered as she placed her hand in his. The crowd parted as he led her to the dance floor. The fiddler, after a moment's hesitation, struck up a waltz. Jake's hand was warm on her waist, his other holding hers with gentle strength. They moved together as if they'd done this 100 times before, and Eleanor forgot about the watching eyes, the whispers, everything but the man holding her. "Thank you," she whispered. "I meant what I said." He replied, his voice low. "You deserve better than their small minds and smaller hearts." "I don't care what they think," Eleanor realized with surprise. "Not anymore." Jake's hand tightened on her waist. "Good, because you're worth a dozen of them." They danced in silence after that, but Eleanor felt the shift between them, the acknowledgement of something deeper than employer and employee. Around them, other couples gradually joined the dancing, the crisis passing into just another story for the gossip mill. But Eleanor didn't care, in Jake's arms, with his strength surrounding her and his rare smile warming his eyes. She felt truly safe for the first time in her life. Let them talk, she thought. Let them whisper and judge and speculate. She had found something worth fighting for at the Double M Ranch, and judging by the fierce protectiveness in Jake's eyes, she wasn't the only one willing to fight for it. The morning after the barn dance dawned gray and oppressive, with storm clouds gathering over the mountains like harbingers of trouble. Eleanor moved through her morning routine, but her mind kept returning to the dance in Jake's arms, the warmth in his eyes, the way he'd defended her before the entire community. She was feeding the chickens when she heard the horses approaching. Multiple horses moving fast. Her heart sank as she recognized Margaret's voice rising above the thunder of hooves. "Eleanor! Eleanor! You ungrateful wretch! I know you're here!" Eleanor stood frozen as Margaret dismounted from a borrowed horse, her black dress billowing in the rising wind. Behind her rode Sheriff Coleman, a tired-looking man in his 50s, and Thomas Garrett, his face still bearing the marks of Jake's fists. Jake and Sam emerged from the barn, both armed, their faces grim. "Sheriff," Jake said evenly, "to what do we owe this visit?" Sheriff Coleman dismounted slowly, clearly uncomfortable. "Sorry about this. Jake, Mrs. Blackwood here's made some serious allegations. Says you kidnapped her stepdaughter, that money changed hands illegally." "That's a lie," Jake said flatly. "He bought her," Margaret shrieked, pointing a trembling finger at Eleanor. "Paid me $800 to take her, and now I realize what a terrible mistake I made." "My poor dear Eleanor, subjected to God knows what degradation." "Stop." Eleanor stepped forward, her voice cutting through Margaret's performance. "Just stop." Margaret's eyes glittered with malice. "There you are, my dear child. Come here at once. I've come to take you home where you belong." "I'm not going anywhere with you," Eleanor said, surprised by the steadiness of her own voice. "You'll do as you're told." Margaret started toward her, but Jake stepped between them. "Sheriff, I have a legal contract of employment signed by Judge Brennan." Jake said, "Miss Hartley is a free woman working for wages. Any money that changed hands was a personal matter between Mrs. Blackwood and myself. Sheriff Coleman looked relieved. If you've got papers from Judge Brennan, that's good enough for me. Papers can be forged. Garrett interjected. Everyone knows Mitchell's been keeping her out here for his own purposes. Just look at her, dressed up pretty, living in his house. It ain't natural. What's not natural is a woman beating her stepdaughter half to death, Sam said hotly. Which is what was happening before Jake stepped in. Margaret's face contorted. How dare you? I took that ungrateful girl in when her father died, gave her a home. You made me a slave. Eleanor's voice rose with years of suppressed anger. You beat me, starved me, worked me until I could barely stand. You told everyone my mother was a prostitute, that I was cursed, worthless. You took everything my father left and gave me nothing but cruelty in return. The silence that followed her outburst was deafening. Even the wind seemed to pause. The girl's clearly been influenced, Margaret said, recovering, poisoned against me by these men. Sheriff, I demand you return my property to me immediately. I am not property, Eleanor shouted. I am not yours to demand or control or sell. But you were sold. Margaret smiled triumphantly. You admit it. Money changed hands. That makes the transaction illegal and void. You belong with me. Judge Brennan's arrival was like a blessing from above. The old judge rode up on his mule, looking irritated at having his morning disturbed. What's all this commotion? Sheriff Coleman, why are you bothering these good people? The situation was explained, with multiple voices talking over each other. Judge Brennan raised a hand for silence and turned to Eleanor. Miss Hartley, are you here of your own free will? Yes, Your Honor, Eleanor said firmly. And you signed an employment contract with Mr. Mitchell? I did. Then I fail to see the issue. The judge turned to Margaret. Mrs. Blackwood, you have no legal claim on this woman. She's of age and free to work where she chooses. But he paid me, Margaret protested. Doesn't that prove? It proves you accepted money, Judge Brennan said dryly. What it was for is between you and your conscience, unless you're admitting to selling a human being, which would be slavery and has been illegal since the war ended. Margaret's mouth opened and closed like a landed fish. Garrett stepped forward. This ain't over. Everyone knows what's really going on here. A young woman living with two men, no chaperone. I'll chaperone, a clear voice announced. Everyone turned to see Mary Henderson driving up in her wagon, Sarah beside her. The older woman climbed down with determined movements. I've heard enough of this nonsense, Mary declared. Eleanor, pack your things. You're coming to stay with us. Now, Mary, Jake started. Don't now marry me. Jake Mitchell. This situation has gotten out of hand. The girl's reputation is at stake. Mary turned to Eleanor. You'll stay with us during the week, help with the household. Weekends you can return here to tend the garden and such. It's a perfectly respectable arrangement. Eleanor felt her heart sink. Leave the double M? Leave Jake? But she could see the wisdom in Mary's offer, the protection it would provide against gossip. That's not necessary, Jake said, his jaw tight. It is if you care about her future, Mary said pointedly. A young woman's reputation once ruined can never be recovered. Is that what you want for her? Jake's shoulders sagged slightly. He turned to Eleanor. It's your choice. It's always been your choice. Eleanor looked between them. Jake, who'd saved her. Mary, who was trying to protect her. Margaret, whose face was twisted with thwarted fury. The choice seemed impossible. She began, then stopped. Thunder rumbled overhead, and the first fat raindrops began to fall. This is ridiculous, Margaret shrieked. She belongs to me. I raised her. You did nothing but hurt her, Jake said quietly, dangerously. And if you come near her again, sheriff or no sheriff, You'll what? Garrett taunted. Threaten a woman. Real brave. Mitchell. The situation was spiraling toward violence. Eleanor could feel it in the air, thick as the approaching storm. She made her decision. I'll accept Mrs. Henderson's offer, she said quickly. But only if I can continue working here. This job, This place, it's given me purpose. I won't give that up." Mary nodded approvingly. "Fair enough, Jake. You can pay her wages to me, and I'll see she gets them. Everything proper and above board." "This isn't over," Margaret hissed. "That money he gave me, I'll say it was a bribe, that he forced me." "Then you'll be admitting to taking a bribe," Judge Brennan observed, "which would make you guilty of a crime. I suggest you take your $800 and be grateful." "Madam, unless you'd prefer I investigate exactly how you came to have guardianship of Miss Hartley in the first place. Those papers you showed after Thomas Hartley's death seemed rather convenient." Margaret went white. Without another word, she mounted her horse and rode off, not even waiting for Garrett. The sheriff tipped his hat apologetically and followed, leaving Garrett to make his own retreat with whatever dignity he could muster. As the group dispersed, Jake caught Eleanor's arm gently. "You don't have to do this," he said quietly. "I can protect you here." "I know," Eleanor said, her throat tight. "But Mary's right. My reputation. If I ever want a future, a real life, I can't give them more ammunition." She managed a weak smile. "It's only during the week. I'll still be here weekends." Something flickered in Jake's eyes. Disappointment, perhaps, or something deeper. "If that's what you want. It's what's necessary," Eleanor corrected softly. An hour later, her few possessions were loaded into Mary's wagon. The rain had started in earnest, turning the yard to mud. Jake helped her up onto the wagon seat, his hands lingering on hers. "This isn't goodbye," Eleanor said, as much for herself as for him. "No," Jake agreed. "It's not." As the wagon pulled away, Eleanor looked back to see him standing in the rain, a solitary figure against the backdrop of the mountains. Her heart ached with the leaving, even knowing she'd return in just a few days. At the Henderson Ranch, Mary showed her to a small but comfortable room. "You'll share with Sarah," she explained. "Help with cooking, cleaning, mending. Nothing you haven't been doing, just with more appreciation and less isolation." "Why are you doing this?" Eleanor asked. Mary's stern face softened. "Because I've got daughters of my own. Because I remember what it's like to be young and vulnerable in a hard world. And because—" She paused, then continued more quietly. "Because I've seen how Jake Mitchell looks at you, and how you look at him. If something's going to come of that, it should be done proper. You deserve a courtship, not just proximity." Eleanor felt her cheeks burn. "I don't know what you mean," Mary snorted. "Girl, I've got eyes. That man's half in love with you already, and you're not far behind. But rushing into things because of gossip and circumstance isn't the answer. Take some time. Let him court you proper. Let the town see you're a respectable woman worthy of respect." That night, as Eleanor lay in the unfamiliar bed listening to Sarah's gentle breathing, she thought about Mary's words. Courtship. The very idea seemed fantastical. What did she know of courting? Her life had been survival, not romance. But she thought of Jake's rare smiles, his protective fury, the way he'd held her during their dance. Maybe Mary was right. Maybe taking this step back would lead to something more. Something built on solid ground rather than desperate circumstance. The next morning brought a new routine, helping Mary with breakfast for her large family, mending clothes with Sarah, learning the rhythms of a household run with love rather than fear. The Henderson children, ranging from 6 to 16, accepted her with the easy adaptability of youth. But even as Eleanor settled into this new life, her thoughts returned constantly to the double M. To Jake, facing his evenings alone again. To Sam, probably burning their supper. To her garden, her chickens, the view from the porch as the sun set behind the mountains. Thursday afternoon, she was helping Mary with laundry when a familiar horse appeared in the yard. Her heart leaped as Jake dismounted, hat in hand. "Afternoon, Mary, Miss Hartley." His eyes lingered on Eleanor. "Came to see if you might spare Eleanor for a ride. Daisy's missing her something fierce." Mary studied him shrewdly. "Sarah can go along as chaperone." "Of course," Jake agreed readily. The ride was both wonderful and torture. Eleanor on Daisy, Jake on Banner, Sarah trailing behind on her own mount, playing chaperone with obvious amusement. They couldn't speak freely, couldn't share the easy companionship of the ranch, but Jake's presence alone was enough to lift Eleanor's spirits. "Garden's looking poorly without you," he said as they paused at a stream to water the horses. "I'll tend it Saturday," Eleanor promised. "Sam's cooking's about to kill us both," he added with a slight smile. "I'll prepare some things you can reheat," she offered. They looked at each other across the space between their horses. So much unspoken hanging in the air. Sarah cleared her throat pointedly, and the moment broke. As they rode back, Eleanor realized this was what Mary had meant by courtship. These careful meetings, chaperoned rides, the slow building of something that could withstand public scrutiny. It wasn't the dramatic rescue of their beginning, but perhaps it was something better, a foundation for a future. When Saturday finally came, Eleanor could barely contain her eagerness to return to the Double M. Will Henderson drove her in the wagon, keeping up a steady stream of talk about cattle prices and weather predictions. The moment the ranch came into view, Eleanor felt something in her chest ease. "Home," her heart whispered, though she tried not to listen. Jake was waiting on the porch, trying to look casual and failing entirely. "Welcome back," he said simply, but his eyes said more. "Thank you," Eleanor replied, matching his restraint even as her pulse quickened. The weekend flew by in a blur of familiar tasks made precious by their temporary nature. She tended her garden, cooked enough meals to last the men several days, mended everything she could find. But it was the evenings that glowed in her memory. Jake playing his fiddle while she sang. Sam telling stories, the three of them creating a circle of warmth against the vast darkness outside. Sunday evening came too soon. As Will arrived to collect her, Jake walked her to the wagon. "This arrangement," he said quietly, "it won't be forever. Once people see you're respectable. Once the gossip dies down." "I know," Eleanor said softly. "I can wait." Jake helped her into the wagon, his hands warm and steady. "So can I," he said, and the promise in his voice followed her all the way back to the Henderson ranch. The pattern was established. Weeks passed, and slowly the gossip began to fade. Eleanor's obvious respectability, combined with Mary Henderson's fierce protection, gradually won over the doubtful. Even Constance Simpson was forced to admit that perhaps she'd misjudged the situation. Margaret made no more appearances, apparently deciding that $800 and a strategic retreat were preferable to having her own past investigated. Thomas Garrett nursed his grudges in solitude, unwilling to face Jake again. And through it all, Eleanor held on to the promise of Saturdays, of stolen moments and careful courtship, of a future that grew brighter with each passing day. The road was longer than she'd expected, more complex than the simple rescue she'd experienced, but perhaps that made it more real, more lasting. She was no longer the desperate girl Jake had saved from a beating. She was Eleanor Hartley, respected member of the community, skilled housekeeper, friend to Sarah Henderson, and, though neither had spoken it aloud, the woman who held Jake Mitchell's heart. The future stretched before them, full of possibility. And Eleanor, who had once wished only for survival, now dared to dream of love. The autumn light filtered golden through the windows of Judge Brennan's small courthouse as Eleanor stood before him once more. But this time, everything was different. This time, she wore her mother's wedding dress, carefully altered by Mary Henderson's skilled hands, and Jake Mitchell stood beside her in his finest suit, looking at her like she hung the moon and stars. 6 months had passed since that terrible day when Margaret had tried to reclaim her. 6 months of careful courtship, of chaperoned rides and stolen glances, of slowly building a love that the whole county could see was true and proper. The gossips had finally run out of fuel when faced with Jake's respectful devotion and Eleanor's quiet dignity. "Do you, Eleanor May Hartley, take this man to be your lawfully wedded husband?" Judge Brennan asked, his eyes twinkling behind his spectacles. "I do," Eleanor said, her voice clear and certain. "And do you, Jacob William Mitchell, take this woman to be your lawfully wedded wife?" "I do," Jake replied, his voice rough with emotion. "Then, by the power vested in me by the territory of Wyoming, I pronounce you man and wife. Jake, you may kiss your bride." The kiss was gentle, reverent, a promise of all the tenderness to come. The small gathering, Sam, the Hendersons, a handful of other neighbors who'd become friends, burst into applause. The wedding celebration was held at the Double M, the ranch transformed with wildflowers and ribbons. Mary Henderson had outdone herself organizing the food, and even Sam had pitched in, stringing lanterns around the yard. As the sun set behind the mountains, painting the sky in shades of rose and gold, Eleanor stood on the porch she'd once scrubbed as an employee, now its mistress. "No regrets?" Jake asked, coming up behind her, his arms encircling her waist. Eleanor leaned back against him, feeling the solid warmth of his chest. "How could I regret the best thing that ever happened to me?" "I meant what I said that first day," Jake murmured against her hair. "You always had a choice. You still do." Eleanor turned in his arms, reaching up to touch his face. "I choose you," she said simply. "I choose this life. I choose us." The party continued around them. Sam had brought out his harmonica, and couples were dancing in the yard, but for Eleanor and Jake, the world had narrowed to just the two of them, to this moment of perfect understanding. Later, as the guests departed with well wishes and knowing smiles, Eleanor found herself in the kitchen she'd once entered as a frightened, broken girl. Now she moved through it with the confidence of belonging, of being home. "I should tell you," Jake said, looking almost shy. "I've been working on something." He led her to what had been the storage room beside their bedroom, but when he opened the door, Eleanor gasped. The room had been transformed into a proper study, with bookshelves lining the walls, a writing desk by the window, and a comfortable chair perfect for reading. "You mentioned once that your father taught you to love books," Jake explained. "Thought you might like a place of your own for reading and such. Sarah Henderson said you've been helping her with her letters, teaching the younger children. Thought maybe you'd like to do more of that." Eleanor's eyes filled with tears. Of all the gifts he could have given her, this understanding of her deepest self was the most precious. "Jake Mitchell," she whispered. "How did I get so lucky?" "I'm the lucky one," he replied, pulling her close. "The day I rode past that homestead and saw you. Eleanor, you saved me as much as I saved you. This ranch was just buildings and cattle before you came. You made it a home." Their first winter as husband and wife was harsh, with snows that piled high against the cabin walls and winds that howled like wolves. But inside the Double M, there was warmth and laughter and love. Eleanor's cooking kept them well fed. Her songs brightened the long evenings, and her presence transformed the bachelor dwelling into a true home. Spring brought new life in more ways than one. The garden Eleanor planted was twice the size of the previous years, and she added flowers among the vegetables. "For beauty's sake," she told Jake, who indulged her every whim. The cattle thrived, the ranch prospered, and Eleanor began teaching reading and writing to several of the local children whose families couldn't afford to send them to the school in town. It was a morning in late May when Eleanor first felt the flutter in her belly, like butterfly wings against her ribs. She placed a hand over the spot, wonder flooding through her. That evening, as Jake came in from checking the cattle, she took his hand and placed it where hers had been. "What?" he began. Then his eyes widened as understanding dawned. "Eleanor, are you—" "I think so," she whispered. "I'll need to see Doc Morrison to be sure. But Jake, I think we're going to have a baby." The joy on his face was like sunrise after a long night. He swept her into his arms, spinning her around the kitchen until she laughed and protested that he'd make her dizzy. When he set her down, his hands framed her face with infinite gentleness. "A baby," he breathed. "Our baby. Our baby," Eleanor confirmed, covering his hands with hers. The months that followed were filled with preparation and anticipation. Jake became almost comically protective, trying to prevent Eleanor from doing any work until she firmly reminded him that ranch women had been having babies since the beginning of time. Sam whittled toys and practiced lullabies on his harmonica. Mary Henderson visited weekly with advice and hand-sewn baby clothes. On a crisp October morning, with the aspens turning gold on the mountainsides, Thomas Jacob Mitchell entered the world with a lusty cry that brought tears to his father's eyes. As Eleanor held her son for the first time, Jake beside her with one finger trapped in the baby's tiny fist. She thought about the journey that had brought her here, from a beaten, hopeless girl to a beloved wife and mother, from a life of servitude to one of partnership and purpose. The scars Margaret had left, both physical and emotional, had faded, though they'd never fully disappear. But they'd been overlaid with so much love, so much joy, that they no longer defined her. "He's perfect," Jake whispered, his voice full of awe. "He is," Eleanor agreed, then looked up at her husband with a mischievous smile. "Though I think he needs a sister or two, maybe a brother as well." Jake's laugh was rich and full. "Whatever you say, Mrs. Mitchell, whatever you say." As the sun set over the Double M Ranch, painting the mountains in shades of purple and gold, Eleanor reflected on the twists of fate that had brought her here. That awful day when Jake had witnessed her at her lowest point, when he'd spoken those fateful words, "Don't hurt her, sell her to me," had seemed like the end of everything. Instead, it had been the beginning of freedom, of love, of a life she'd never dared dream was possible. In the barn, the horses nickered softly, cattle lowed in the distance. Sam's harmonica drifted from the bunkhouse, playing a gentle melody. And in the cabin of the Double M Ranch, a family settled in for the evening. Jake in his chair by the fire, Eleanor in her rocker with baby Thomas at her breast, love filling the space between them like warm honey. Outside, the first stars appeared in the vast Wyoming sky. The same stars that had witnessed Eleanor's despair now looked down on her happiness. And somewhere in that vast expanse, she imagined her father smiling, knowing his daughter had found her way home at last. The girl who'd been sold for $800 had become priceless. The woman who'd been told she was worthless had discovered her infinite value, and the heart that had been broken had been mended with threads of gold, stronger and more beautiful for having been tested. As Thomas finished nursing and Eleanor handed him to Jake for burping, she caught her husband's eye. No words were needed. In that look was everything: gratitude, love, promise, and the bone-deep contentment of two souls who had found their match. The future stretched before them, bright with possibility. There would be challenges, Eleanor knew, droughts and harsh winters, sickness and setback. But there would also be laughter and music, more children, and the deep satisfaction of building something lasting together. She'd been rescued, yes, but in the end, she'd rescued herself by choosing to trust, to love, to believe in the possibility of happiness even when all seemed lost. And Jake had simply been the man wise enough to see the treasure beneath the tarnish, brave enough to claim it, and gentle enough to polish it until it shone. Their love story would become legend in the county. The cowboy who'd bought a bride and won a true partner. The woman who'd risen from servitude to become the heart of the Double M Ranch. But for Eleanor and Jake, it was simpler than that. It was home, it was family, it was love, and it was more than enough. Thank you so much for listening to this Wild West love story. I hope Eleanor and Jake's journey touched your heart as much as it touched mine while sharing it with you. Where are you listening to this story from? I'd love to know. Please share in the comments below so we can connect with fellow listeners from around the world. Don't forget to subscribe to the From Wild West channel and share your thoughts about Eleanor and Jake's romance. What was your favorite moment? Let me know in the comments.